Hello class and welcome to MSc 402. This is your week 2 module 2 video lecture and it's on project initiating, the project initiating phase. So let's go ahead and jump into our model. The PMI-PMBOK model, the project management body of knowledge model, talks about there being 5 phases that it officially recognizes that a project goes through. And you'll see that what we're talking about this week, or in this module, is the initiating phase, that process group for the initiating phase. And once again, you can see in the video image below my image, there are 10 knowledge areas associated with this. But let's go ahead and jump into the model or the module that we've got set up for you that you're functioning in. And you're going to see that last week we explored the introduction phase. This week we're going to be exploring the initiating phase, how we initiate a project. And you're going to see that the areas that we cover in the initiating phase are identification of the stakeholders, both internal and external, and development of the team charter. The team charter is that official document that starts a project off, and then the scope statement. How do we put together what the scope statement looks like, where we kind of pull together all the major components of the project and identify those. So let's go ahead and jump in once again to that initiating phase, and you can see the components that we've identified for you. And one of the things I want to once again pull out for you and make you recognize is that off to the side of this model, that bar that says changes, that you can see that there are changes that are constantly happening through all of these phases. So even in this particular area, in the initiating process group, there will be changes that come in. You will need to make modifications, or things will evolve, especially in the team charter and potentially in the scope statement. So the initiating process group consists of those processes performed to define the initial project scope and obtain authorization to start the project. That project charter, once it's published, is that initiation. The initial financial resources are committed along with identification of internal and external stakeholders who's influenced the overall outcome of the project. This is where we actually start pulling the team members together. So you've got your initial team at this point. So let's talk about project initiating phase. Every project is unique in its objectives. Remember, that's the one characteristic that makes a project different than other types of initiatives that you're working with, and each one is different. Each one has a start point, a finish point, and there's an estimated budget for how much it's going to cost to complete that. That's what we're looking at in the project initiating phase. The initiation phase can mean different things to different organizations, but a simple way to kind of, separate it from the rest of the project life cycle is this. Everything that occurs before a project is approved is before the initiating phase. Everything that happens in that and before detailed planning occurs. Typically, the initiating phase is where the project sponsor works in tandem with the project manager to clarify 3 main areas. These are the 3 main things: the project's objectives, the scope, and the constraints. Those are the areas that happen to be worked in conjunction with the project manager during this phase. Once that is initially presented, it goes into the project charter, and then what we refer to as timelines and schedules and budgets and preliminary resource plans are laid out in more detail. So you can see that this is one of those areas where it is an evolution. Now, when we start talking about project initiating and we start talking about creating, or the need to create clear objectives, there's a cartoon that I've illustrated for you here, and it talks about, from a customer's perspective, how the first image off to me was how the customer explained it versus how the project leader understood it versus how the analyst designed it, how the programmer wrote it, and how the business consultant described it. So you can see that everybody's viewpoint is a little bit different when we start looking at what people thought it looked like. The bottom illustration is how the project was documented, or lack of documentation, what operations actually installed versus how the customer was billed, and how it was supported versus what the customer really needed. And you can see that each step along the way, everyone who looked at this saw it or understood it differently than what the original scope should have been. So ultimately, you have to remember, when we start identifying the goals, the elements, the tasks, the subtasks, the clarity that we need is really, really important, because it can be interpreted in multiple ways. That's why scope statements are an evolution of the project charter. Project charter kind of sets up what the initial scope looks like. The scope statement is where we really refine it. Those are the two areas we're really going to explore. And ideally, if an objective is clear, you can show it to 5 people, and all 5 people would understand it exactly the same way. So let's talk about that project charter first. The project charter is the first official document that anoints a project. Until a project charter is published, it is not officially considered a project. It's all just words on paper up until this point. This point, the project charter, is where we actually identify funding, and funding is set off to the side and work actually begins. This is the authority to proceed for a project manager. And there are a few things that I'm going to describe to you over the next 4 slides that are required in a project charter. So within the ECS company that we have you working for, you'll notice that the project charter template that we've made available for you has specific areas that must be filled out. 1, the project title. There should be a unique title or name for the project itself. Remember, each project is unique, but you want to name it something that's emblematic, something that is, something that is rememberable, so that when you hear the title of the project, you have an understanding of what the scope is. The second area in the project charter is going to be the project description, the mission and the purpose. What is the purpose of this project? What is our mission? What are we trying to accomplish for our stakeholders? And those stakeholders can be both internal and external. Make sure you remember that. And then, which of the requirements are we trying to fulfill? So if there are specific documented requirements, you should be mimicking exactly, one for one, what those requirements are, because that's what you're trying to accomplish, is that one for one requirements traceability from what was proposed versus what we're accomplishing when we go to buy it off at the end of the project. Then there should be some level of project description. And I know that at this point it may be somewhat abstract, but we're trying to put as much detail in it as we can. What do we want to do with this project? What will this project produce? And is there a final, is there a final project? If so, what does it look like? Give me that description. That's the project description. And then section 4 is going to be the business case. You want to fill out the business case. Why are our stakeholders going to approve this project? Will we gain any money from it? Will we lose money from it? Is there a regulation in place that requires this project to be in compliance with something? ASQ 9100, ISO 9000, depending on, if it's a software program, CMMI, level 1 through level 5, what is there, as far as regulations in place? If it's an FDA project, for the Federal Drug Administration, there's a series of those. If the project is something associated with a construction project, there are state and federal regulations that it must be in compliance with. If there's something that it must be in compliance with, you need to document that. You want to make sure that is in the project charter. Now you'll notice in the template that we give you specific examples of types of elements that you would fill into each one of these cells. You want to make sure and strip that away when you put your information in there, but it's there for you to just understand what type of documentation we're looking for. Element 5, or section 5, is on project manager authority level. Who will be our project manager for this project? This is where someone's name actually will go into here, and that person is accountable for this project. How much authority will they have? We want to describe that. Will the company be sponsoring the project? Yes, no, and if so, how much money will they have in their budget? This is where we start to lay out what we anticipate is the estimated cost of the project. Now, we're not, you have to remember, this is a 10,000 foot level document. Once we get into the scope statement and the work breakdown structure, we'll really get a lot more detail, but for now what we're looking at is an estimation of what the project is. The next thing is, who are the key people from a stakeholder standpoint? Internal, external. Who does the project manager have to work with to complete this project? We need to identify those people. And if we don't know the people's names, but we do know a department or a division or a specific person, you need to go ahead and identify that. And then number 7, the objectives. What result will we obtain in order to verify that the project was completed? What is the overall objective? What do we have to do? And if it's a service, what service will be performed? What resources will be required? And what other objectives will we need to attain in order to be successful? Now, the next page is where we start to pull in the last of the details required on that project charter. Number 8. I need you to identify any of the milestones, because there should be at least 3 or 4 milestones in any project. The first milestone is always to start the project. Project start is a milestone. The last milestone is the closing of the project. Project end is a milestone. So you have 2 milestones that you've captured in any project. And then in addition to that, significant events along the way. What are those? Identify them and make sure that you call them milestones. These would be things that as we're going along incrementally, we can buy the project off to. Now, number 9 is the success criteria and high-level requirements. I want you to identify, how are we going to judge this project as either succeeding or failing? What's the success criteria? How will the stakeholders use measurable criteria for judging whether the project was successful? And number 9, which stakeholder requirements must the project meet? All of these are required in the project charter. Now, number 10 is going to be the budget, and this is going to be, remember, at a 10,000 foot level. What's our initial budget for the project? Someone at the program office or somewhere is going to tell you that you've got $100,000, $250,000, $2.2 million for your project. They're going to give you what your budget is. Your budget is that initial estimation, and you can see that in this particular environment that you're working for with the ECS company, we've given you an initial working budget. You would document that here, and then is this flexible or is the budget a not to be exceeded? You need to determine that. And then number 11, the resources that are pre-assigned. So you need to understand what pre-assigned resources we have available. Now, finally, as we get towards the end of the document, I need you to identify known high-level risks at this point. These are the obvious high-level risks. These are what we call the known knowns. The unknown unknowns are things that you're going to start to find as we're moving through the project. But right now, what are the known knowns? What are the big risks that you can see? What are the things that could go wrong? Describe them. Make sure that we understand, what mistakes could be made. The next field is going to be that approvals requirements. This is where we start to formalize the charter. Who is required to approve this project? You identify who that is. Who has ownership of the success or failure? Once again, you will go ahead and identify who that's going to be, and then who will sign off on it. When the project is completed, and this may be where you say you want to put my name in there, you're more than welcome to do that, but you need a name in there. Who's going to sign off on the project? In certain projects, it could be somebody from a specific group that signs off on it from a closure standpoint. You get to determine that. Are there sections who will need to sign off before we can proceed to the next step? So if you're in a building type of environment, you may have to have people come in and pull certs, and they may have inspections. So the plumbers may come in and do the plumbing, and then you may have to buy that off before you can put the electrical in. Once the electrical's in, then you may have to get that bought off before you can then come in and put drywall. That's just an example. Number 14, high-level assumptions and constraints. We want to make sure that you identify any high-level what we'll call assumptions or constraints associated with your project. That's part of the project charter. And then finally, once that's done, the project is anointed. Now, once we've finished the project charter, I want you and your team to start looking at putting together the project scope. And let's talk about what project scope is. It's the part of project planning that involves determining and documenting the specifics. What are the project goals, the deliverables, the features, the functions, the tasks, deadlines, and ultimately a higher fidelity of cost estimation. In other words, it's what's needed to achieve what we refer to as the work that needs to be done to deliver the project. And it's going to ask you to go ahead and identify a series of characteristics. And we've got a template for you, but in a project scope, or when we look at project scope, you're going to be identifying the project objectives, the goals, the sub-phases, the tasks, subtasks, resources, budget, and schedule required to make that project come to life and be deliverable to your customer. So when we're creating a scope statement, let's talk about what's necessary. So there's a checklist, realistically, of things that need to be identified and then still need to be not only identified, but defined. You really need to put some granularity into what we refer to as the customer requirements. Ultimately, any project's going to have a series of types of, I'll call it, requirements that need to be met before you can sell that project off. And these need to be defined. Those definitions should be clear, very clear, concise, definitive, and quantitative. Not qualitative, but quantitative. How can I physically measure meeting this requirement? The scope will lay out the work results, the outputs, and everything that needs to be produced in a project. Anything outside of what we've described in the scope statement is typically called out of scope. Out of scope means that I don't have funding for it. I can't allow you to do that work. Everything that's internal to scope, these are all activities that must be completed for the project to be successful and to be bought off. So when we talk about one of the first things, it's the scope statement. The scope statement, to be practical, is generally created with the input of all of the team members, your key group of team members. There should be somebody there from every area that's going to touch the project so they can provide for you a good definitive understanding of what's required within that area of scope. So remember that a project moves from element to element to element to element. You should have people from each one of these areas involved so that they can tell you exactly what is required. They can give you an accurate estimation of what it will take for us to complete that element of the scope statement. It's really where we take that 10,000 foot level at the project charter type of element, and now that we're down into the scope statement and that document, this is where we really sharpen our pen or pencil, and we start to look at what will it actually take. What are the tasks? What are the subtasks? What are the components necessary? You need to understand that. Now, in the following slides, we're going to give you more of a practitioner-based scope statement, and we're going to walk you through what the elements of it are. So once again, for your project that you've selected, you are now going to be putting together more of that detail. You've gone ahead and completed the project charter, which gave you the outline. It gives you the bare bones structure. It gives you an estimated budget. It gives you a timeline. You're going to start here, end here, roughly the project's this long. The scope statement is where we really start to put more detail into that. Now, you'll see in the template that we've provided for you from ECS, there are descriptions and sample areas that talk about what's required in each one of these areas. But let's talk about the first one is the description of the project scope. This is where you go into great detail to describe what the project is. You give as much detail as possible there, and then we're going to talk about the deliverables. What are the deliverables from this project? What is due to the customer or to the stakeholders that make us have the ability to sell this project off at the end. What are the services, tangible products, what's created for this project? The next component is going to be the project objectives. And you can take the project objectives that you had from your project charter, and you can translate them down here into this, but you need to then add additional detail. Because down here you're going to need to include the quality of the project, the cost of the project, a good clear understanding of that. Not necessarily your budget that you had up in the project charter, but what you estimate the cost to be, the schedule, how long do you think it's really going to take, and the scope, a good clear understanding of the scope. Now, we're going to take what we put together previously and we're going to elaborate on that. So the project assumptions at this level of the scope statement, this is where we're really talking about how do we make this happen? What are the assumptions that must be documented here for you to be able to complete this project? The same thing with the constraints. I need you to give me any level of constraints you feel you're going to have. And then finally, exclusions. You may determine that you have specific areas of the project that you want to put an exclusion in. I cannot control certain things happening. Things that are associated with weather, lightning, rain, snow, all of those are areas that certain people will put exclusions in based upon, because these are acts of God that they have no control over. There may be other types of exclusions that you want to make sure you document within your, I'll call it technology, or your area within the project. The next one is going to be the project acceptance criteria. What exactly is the acceptance criteria for your project to get bought off? And then finally, the next area is going to be the technical requirements. This is where I want you to really go in. I want you to look at what you think the technical requirements are going to be for this project. Identify all of them so that we make sure that we've got an avenue to buy them off. You'll notice that milestones have not been included on this list. At this point, we're looking at technical requirements. Okay? Finally, the one thing I need you to know is that the initiating closing phase, when we finish the initiating phase, you're going to then start really pulling together finite detail. You're going to put together the schedule. You're going to start to look at resource loading against things. All of those kind of components. But you have to have a starting point. You have to have this project scope statement completed. Once it is completed, you can then move on to the next phase. But during the initiation phase, the initiating phase, to close it, you've got to have a clean project charter and you have to have a project scope statement. That document has to be filled in with as much detail as possible for you to move forward to the next phase. So congratulations on finishing the first phase. We're into the second phase, which is project initiating closing, or the initiating phase. Have a great week. If you've got any questions or need additional detail, feel free to reach out to me and ask me for any of those questions. Have a great week, and we'll talk soon. Goodbye.